WFYI podcasts are brought to you by Visit Bloomington. With over 350 restaurants to choose from, Bloomington, Indiana is truly a food lover's paradise. Go to visitbloomington.com to discover what suits your taste.
This is WFYI News Now. It's February 28th, and I'm Abriana Herron. On today's show, a House committee votes to approve a bill effectively killing the Indianapolis Blue Line. An election commission votes to deny an effort to keep Donald Trump off of the Indiana primary ballot. And questions of residency were at the heart of the years-long case against former Wabash Township trustee Jennifer Teising. We've got a conversation with reporter Dave Bangert, who says some of those questions remain.
Part of their argument for Jennifer Teising was that in a modern day, you don't have to live someplace to do the work.
Those stories coming up. But first, a federal appeals court yesterday allowed Indiana's ban on gender-affirming care to go into effect, removing a temporary injunction a judge issued last year. The ruling was handed down by a panel of justices on the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago. It marks the latest decision in a legal challenge the American Civil Liberties Union of Indiana filed against the ban. Enacted last spring amid a national push by GOP-led legislatures to curb LGBTQ+ rights. The law was slated to go into effect on July 1st, 2023. But the month before, U.S. District Court Judge James Patrick Hanlon issued an injunction preventing most of it from taking effect. Hanlon blocked the state from prohibiting minors' access to hormone therapies and puberty blockers, but allowed the law's prohibition on gender-affirming surgeries to take effect. Hanlon's order also blocked provisions that would prohibit Indiana doctors from communicating with out-of-state doctors about gender-affirming care for their patients younger than 18. The ACLU of Indiana brought the lawsuit on behalf of 4 youths undergoing gender-affirming treatments and an Indiana doctor who provides such care. The lawsuit argued the ban would violate the U.S. Constitution's equal protection guarantees and trampled upon the rights of parents to decide medical treatment for their children. In a written statement Tuesday, the ACLU of Indiana called the appeals court's ruling heartbreaking for transgender youth, their doctors, and families. Indiana Attorney General Todd Rokita called the state law common sense in a post on X, formerly known as Twitter, Tuesday evening. And a House committee voted yesterday to approve a bill effectively killing the Indianapolis Blue Line, the city's third bus rapid transit system. Months of testimony on the bill led to an emotional hearing in the House Roads and Transportation Committee. An amendment to the bill now makes the legislation Marion County specific. Representative Blake Johnson broke into tears as he urged fellow lawmakers to oppose the legislation.
This is really, really, really bad public policy. It targets one city, now just one city.
The bill puts a 1-year moratorium on dedicated lanes in Indianapolis to study the transportation option, something Indigo officials say will likely scuttle federal funds for the project. Committee Chair Jim Pressel says he struggled with the bill.
But I think this is the right thing to do. This is the pause that needs to take place so that we can have an overall conversation about road funding.
The bill now heads to the full House. The Indiana Election Commission yesterday voted to deny an effort to keep former President Donald Trump off of the Indiana primary ballot. The challenge, which mirrors similar efforts in other states, argued that Trump allegedly engaged in an insurrection after losing the 2020 election to Joe Biden, making him ineligible to run for president. Election Commission member Karen Celestino-Horseman was the sole vote in favor of the challenge.
While Donald Trump didn't storm the steps of the Capitol, he is the one who aimed and pulled the trigger on the violence that occurred on January 6th.
Election Commission Chair Paul Okeson, along with the rest of the commission, voted against the challenge.
I think it's up to the people of Indiana to decide how Indiana elects its next president.
A similar effort in Colorado is currently in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And for our final story today, earlier this month, the Indiana Supreme Court vacated a case against former Wabash Township trustee Jennifer Teising, saying she should not have faced criminal charges. WFYI's Ben Thorpe sat down with Lafayette reporter Dave Bangert to talk about the case against Teising and what the case says about residency requirements for elected officials.
Dave, we reached out to you because you have been covering this from the start. And I want to start with, former Wabash Township trustee Jennifer Teising was indicted in early 2021 on multiple theft charges for taking her trustee salary while allegedly no longer living within the township. What led up to that initial indictment?
Well, it really goes back to the elections in 2018. We had kind of a mini blue wave here in town, and she was part of that. When COVID hit, she started apparently traveling around. She had sold her house, started moving in with friends and living in their driveways in other parts of the state and in Florida and other places. People started wondering where she was.
Teising was initially found guilty on all counts in early 2022, with Judge Kirsten McVeigh writing that Teising forfeited her position because of how much time she spent outside the township. Maybe you can talk about one of the outstanding questions of that trial, which, at least for me, was what requirements are there under state law for an elected official to live within the area that they represent?
In court, they use cell phone records to track the fact that she was only here a handful of days over the course of about 6 months. But that was the question, is what does it mean to reside somewhere? When does a vacation mean that you don't live somewhere? And the fact that she was claiming to still do her work. She was still in touch with her assistant at the township. So there was a lot in court about whether she had intent to leave or didn't have intent to leave. And the judge ruled that it was a bench trial, 3 days. She took about 3 weeks to rule and said, yes, she was not a resident, so this was theft.
When the Indiana Court of Appeals overturned Teising's guilty verdict late in 2022, they argued that the state had not provided enough evidence that Teising planned to vacate her Wabash Township residence and live elsewhere. The more recent Indiana Supreme Court decision went a step further and said that the state failed to provide proof of any criminal intent at all. Maybe it's worth asking what you think the knock-on effects or the ripple effects of this case might be. Obviously, we've seen changes to state law, but this question feels like it's still out there about residency and what does it mean to be a resident of a place that you represent?
Yeah, it's made people here really hyper vigilant about it. You see more challenges of candidates before they run. That's been kind of a follow-on thing. We had another trustee who was in trouble for a completely different kinds of theft questions and not residency. But I think the residency thing will continue here. I think it'll just keep coming up in some fashion. And a part of their argument for Jennifer Teising was that in a modern day, you don't have to live someplace to do the work. In an age of remote offices and remote employees, that a trustee could do the work. So it made it a little more complicated. I think everybody wanted the Supreme Court to at least address that. I think also you talk about the follow-on. Almost 3 years later, from the heat of all this, a lot of people have wanted to move on. I actually heard quite a bit after I wrote about it. Is she back in the news again? I think people had some lingering bad taste in their mouth of the whole thing and thought maybe this will go away. But for her, it means that she doesn't go to jail.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Sure.
That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by the following people who live in your community: Darian Benson, Drew Dodlin, Kendall Antron, who composed the music for this podcast, and me, Abriana Herron. Our news director is Sarah Neal Estes. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.